Let me begin with something incredibly ordinary. Something so common that most of us have never stopped to question it. You have a birth certificate. Your parents have one? Your grandparents probably did too. It's a document we treat as completely natural proof that you were born, proof that you exist, proof that the world officially recognizes you. You bring it to the DMV when applying for a driver's license. You show it when applying for a passport. It becomes the foundation for your social security number, school enrollment, employment records, and nearly every official step in modern life. It feels like a birthright. But here is the strange part. For most of human history, thousands of years of civilizations, empires, trade networks, wars, and governments, people did not have birth certificates at all. Not one. And then, within a surprisingly short period of time, roughly around the turn of the 20th century, nearly every industrialized nation on Earth suddenly decided that every child needed one almost simultaneously. That realization is where the questions begin, because the world before birth certificates was not some chaotic primitive landscape. It was a world that functioned remarkably well without government-issued identity documents for every individual. Take ancient Rome, for example. The Roman state conducted censuses to track citizens, but those records focused on households, property, and family units. What mattered was the family, the household as an economic and social entity, not the precise, time-stamped moment an individual entered the world. Later, in medieval Europe, most records of birth were kept by churches. Parish registers documented baptisms, marriages, and deaths. Clergy carefully maintained these records for religious and community purposes, but these were not government systems, and most importantly, ordinary people did not carry these records with them through daily life. You didn't need to present a document proving your birth in order to work, travel, or participate in society. Your community simply knew who you were. This raises a fascinating question. If massive civilizations like the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and even the early British Empire could govern millions of people without issuing each citizen an official birth certificate, what changed? Why did governments suddenly need to document the exact moment every person entered the world? At first glance, the answer seems straightforward. Historians often point to public health. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, governments were trying to better understand infant mortality, disease patterns, and population growth. Accurate birth records help doctors and statisticians track these trends, and that explanation is partly true, but it doesn't fully explain the scale of what was built, because the birth certificate didn't remain a simple health statistic. Over time, it became something much larger, the foundation of legal identity in the modern world. In the United States, a major push for standardized birth registration began in 1902, when the Census Bureau created what was called the birth registration area. States that could prove they recorded at least 90% of births were recognized as part of the system. At first, only a handful of states qualified, but the expansion happened quickly. By 1915, 10 states and Washington, D.C. had joined. By 1933, just 3 decades later, every state in the country had adopted standardized birth registration. 30 years. In the span of a single generation, the United States completely transformed how it documented the existence of every human being born within its borders. And when you look at what else happened during those same decades, the timing becomes even more interesting. In 1913, the Federal Reserve was created. That same year, the 16th Amendment introduced the federal income tax. In 1917, the government required millions of men to register for the military draft during World War I. And in 1935, the Social Security system was established, a program that required reliable proof of age and identity for every citizen. Right in the middle of all these developments, the birth certificate quietly became something incredibly powerful. It became the root document from which all other forms of legal identity would grow, not just a record of birth, but the starting point of a lifelong administrative trail. Once you start looking at the birth certificate as more than just a record, the entire system around it begins to look different because what emerged in the early 20th century wasn't simply a health database. It was an entirely new administrative framework, one that allowed governments to identify, track, and interact with individuals in ways that had never been possible before. In the United States was not alone. Across the Atlantic, similar changes were unfolding. Britain had created the General Register Office in 1837, which began formal civil registration of births, marriages, and deaths. But it wasn't until the late 19th and early 20th centuries that these records became strictly enforced and widely used as legal proof of identity. France, Germany, Canada, Australia, nation after nation began strengthening civil registration systems during the same historical window. Different governments, different cultures, different political systems. Yet they all arrived at nearly the same administrative architecture. A child is born gives. The birth is recorded gives. A document is issued gives. The document becomes the foundation of legal identity. At first glance, this seems like a natural development of modern bureaucracy. Industrial societies were growing rapidly. Cities were expanding. Governments needed better ways to manage large populations, but as researchers in legal history have pointed out, something deeper may also have been happening, something rooted in the very structure of law itself, because in legal theory, there is an important distinction that most people never think about: the difference between a human being and a legal person. In everyday language, those words sound identical, but in the legal system, they are not the same thing at all. A human being is simply a biological reality, a living organism that breathes, grows, and exists in the world. A legal person, on the other hand, is an entity recognized by law as having rights, responsibilities, and obligations. Corporations are legal persons, cities are legal persons, even ships, in certain legal contexts, can be treated as legal persons. The concept comes from the Latin word persona, originally referring to the masks worn by actors in Roman theater. The mask represented the role being played, the character presented to the audience. In many ways, the legal system works similarly. It interacts not directly with the biological individual, but with the legal identity assigned to that individual, and this is where the birth certificate becomes so important, because once a birth is registered, a record is created in a government ledger. A name is attached. A date and place are recorded. A number is eventually assigned from that moment forward. The state now recognizes a legal identity connected to that person. That identity can be taxed. It can be drafted into military service. It can receive government benefits. It can own property, sign contracts, and participate in the entire economic structure of the modern world. Without that registration, the state would struggle to interact with millions of individuals at scale. Consider taxation. In earlier centuries, taxes were often collected at the household level or through local authorities. But modern tax systems operate differently. Governments track individuals, their income, their employment, their financial activity. To do that efficiently, each person needs a unique administrative identity. In the United States, that identity often takes the form of a social security number, which itself is linked back to birth registration. Now think about military conscription. During World War I and World War II, governments needed to mobilize millions of soldiers. That required reliable proof of age, citizenship, and identity. Birth certificates made that possible. Then there are social programs, Social Security, Medicare, public education, welfare systems. Every one of these programs depends on accurate identity records. Before a person can receive benefits, the state must first confirm that person exists within its administrative system. Birth registration is where that process begins. From there, the chain continues. Marriage records link two identities together. Property records connect identities to land and assets. Death certificates close the record when a life ends. Step by step, a complete administrative timeline is created from birth to death. Seen this way, the birth certificate is not simply a record of the past. It is the opening entry in a lifelong ledger. A system that allows modern governments to manage enormous populations with remarkable precision. And yet, despite how central this document has become to modern life, there was surprisingly little public debate about it when the system was first implemented. No massive philosophical arguments in newspapers. No widespread protests about registering newborn children in government archives. The transformation happened quickly. Quietly. Almost invisibly. And that raises a deeper question, not about what the system does, but about why it spread so rapidly across the world at exactly the same time. Here's where the discussion moves into territory that many people find surprising. In everyday language, the words human and person sound identical. We use them interchangeably. They feel like simple synonyms, but in legal theory, they are not the same thing. A human being is a biological fact. You are born. You breathe. You exist. That requires no legal approval, but a person in the legal sense is something different. A legal person is an entity recognized by the state as having rights, responsibilities, and obligations under the law. In other words, a legal person is something the legal system can interact with, and that category includes more than just people. Corporations are legal persons. Cities are legal persons. Universities and organizations can also be treated as legal persons under the law. The idea traces back to the Latin word persona. In ancient Roman theater, a persona was the mask worn by actors, the face presented to the audience, representing a role within the story. Over time, the legal world adopted the same concept. Persona became the identity that appears inside the system. The role recognized by law, and this is where the birth certificate begins to take on a different meaning. At first glance, it looks like a simple record, a document describing a human life, but legally, it may function as something more important. It creates the official identity that the state recognizes. When a birth is registered, a record is generated. A document enters a government ledger. A name appears alongside a date, a location, and eventually a number. From that moment forward, the state interacts with that registered identity. That identity becomes the legal version of you, the version that can hold property, the version that can pay taxes, the version that can be summoned, licensed, documented, and administered. This doesn't mean the state invented human beings. Obviously, people existed long before paperwork, but it does mean that modern systems require a documented identity before they can interact with you at scale. Without that entry in the system, you are practically invisible to it, and that's where the birth certificate becomes more than a historical curiosity. It becomes the starting point of a lifelong administrative record. Think about what it enables. First, it enables taxation. Not just in the basic sense that the government knows people exist, but in a far more precise way. The system can now track each individual economic actor. In the United States, the Social Security number, which today is often issued shortly after birth, grows directly out of the birth registration system. That number is what allows the Internal Revenue Service to track income, employment, and taxation across an entire lifetime. Second, it enables conscription. When governments needed to mobilize millions of soldiers during the First and Second World Wars, they needed reliable proof of age. Birth certificates made it possible to identify entire generations eligible for military service before centralized records. Organizing such massive drafts would have been extremely difficult. Third, it enables benefit systems, Social Security, Medicare, welfare programs, public schooling. All of these depend on identity verification before the state can provide benefits. It must first confirm who you are, and confirmation begins with the birth record. But perhaps the most powerful effect of this system is something quieter. It creates legibility. The modern state must be able to read its population, like a map, identifying individuals, tracking status changes, connecting records across institutions. Birth certificates are the opening entry in that map. Birth creates the record. Marriage links new records. Property connects financial identity. Death eventually closes the file, a full administrative life cycle, and once you start looking at the system that way, a new question begins to emerge, a question that some legal researchers have debated quietly for decades. What if the birth certificate doesn't simply represent you to the state? What if, in a structural sense, it creates the entity that the state interacts with? Once you begin to see the birth certificate as the creation of a legal identity, another, more unsettling question begins to surface. What if the document does more than simply represent you? What if it integrates you into a much larger financial and administrative system from the very beginning of your life? To understand why some researchers ask this question, we need to look at what governments were doing during the same historical period when birth registration systems expanded across the world. In the early 20th century, states were dramatically increasing their ability to borrow money. Modern governments began issuing large quantities of sovereign bonds, borrowing against future tax revenue to finance infrastructure, wars, and expanding social programs. When investors purchase government bonds, they are essentially betting on the future productivity of that nation's population. The logic is simple. A government can repay debt because its citizens will continue working, producing, earning, and paying taxes over time. Future human productivity becomes the foundation of the state's financial credibility, and here is where the timeline becomes intriguing. Birth registration systems were becoming universal at almost the exact same moment that governments were expanding large-scale public debt systems. Registration created a detailed record of the population, while modern finance relied on projections about that population's future economic output. Some observers have wondered whether these developments evolved together for practical reasons, not because individuals themselves are treated as financial collateral. There is no clear legal evidence of that, but because a precisely documented population makes long-term economic planning possible. Once a state can reliably measure births, deaths, and demographic trends, it gains something incredibly valuable: predictability. Predictability allows governments to forecast workforce growth. Forecasting allows them to estimate tax revenue decades into the future, and those projections support the borrowing that finances modern economies. Seen from that angle, birth certificates are not just identity records, they are part of a much broader system that allows governments to understand, measure, and manage entire populations. Registration, numbering, taxation, public debt, economic planning. All of these structures grew together over the 20th century, forming the administrative backbone of modern states. But what is perhaps most striking is not the system itself. It is the lack of public philosophical debate when it was being built. When societies undergo major transformations, there is usually a long period of argument and reflection. Newspapers publish editorials. Intellectuals debate the consequences. Citizens argue about what is being gained and what might be lost. Yet when historians look back at the early expansion of birth registration systems, the deeper philosophical conversation is surprisingly rare. Public health officials wrote extensively about infant mortality. Statisticians discussed the importance of demographic data. Government administrators promoted the efficiency of standardized records, but the deeper question, what it means for every human life to be formally recorded as an administrative entry in a national ledger, received very little attention in mainstream discussions of the time. Perhaps the change simply felt practical. After all, the early 20th century was an age obsessed with statistics, efficiency, and scientific management. Governments were trying to measure everything: populations, industries, diseases, productivity. Birth registration may have appeared to be just another piece of that broader data revolution, but even so, the speed of the transformation remains remarkable. Within just a few decades, nation after nation adopted nearly identical systems. Different legal traditions, different political systems, different cultures, yet the administrative architecture looked almost the same everywhere. The Individual became the fundamental unit of state. Administration, the birth event became the official beginning of legal identity. The document became the anchor of that identity, and the number became the handle through which bureaucracies could manage it. These ideas did not emerge slowly over centuries. They spread rapidly, almost simultaneously, across much of the industrialized world, which leads us to the final question: if this system reshaped the relationship between individuals and governments so dramatically, what exactly did it replace? To understand the true impact of birth registration, we have to look not only at what was built, but also at what quietly disappeared when the system took hold. Before modern civil registration existed, identity worked very differently. A person was not primarily known through a document stored in a government archive. Instead, recognition came from relationships. Your existence was acknowledged by the people around you. The village knew who you were. The church recorded your baptism. Your family lineage connected you to generations before you. Parish registers tracked births, marriages, and deaths. Local communities remembered names, stories, and family ties. A person's place in society was built through belonging, not through a numbered file in a central office. These systems were far from perfect. They could be exclusionary. Records were sometimes incomplete. Local authorities could manipulate them. But the foundation of identity was still communal recognition. People existed because their community knew they existed. When national birth registration systems emerged, that principle began to change. Recognition gradually shifted away from the village, the parish, and the extended family, and toward something much larger, the modern administrative state. Now, a person's official existence begins not when the community welcomes them, but when the government records them. A child becomes legally visible when a form is filed, a name enters a registry, a number is assigned, and from that moment forward, a parallel identity begins to grow alongside the living human, being a legal identity that moves through institutions. That identity appears in school records. It appears in tax files. It appears in employment databases, banking systems, medical records, property registries, and eventually death certificates. From the first breath to the last, the state-maintained record follows the entire life cycle. Seen in that light, the birth certificate is not just proof that you were born. It is the opening entry in a lifelong administrative ledger. This shift happened so quickly during the early 20th century that most people alive today have never known anything different. To us, the idea of living without a birth certificate feels almost impossible. How would you prove who you are? How would you open a bank account? Travel internationally? Enroll in school? The modern world is built on systems that depend on standardized identity documents. Without them, the machinery of government and global commerce would struggle to function. So the transformation brought undeniable benefits, better public health tracking, clearer legal protections, organized welfare systems, and more reliable economic planning. Yet the philosophical question remains: what does it mean that the foundational document of your legal existence is created before you can speak, before you can choose, before you can even understand what it represents? You are entered into the system at birth. Not by decision, but by default. And the document that anchors your legal life was never created for you personally. It was created about you. That distinction may seem subtle, but it matters, because once a society organizes itself around administrative identity, the relationship between individuals and institutions changes. Governments can manage populations more efficiently, but individuals also become easier to categorize, measure, and regulate. Whether that transformation represents progress, loss, or some complicated mixture of both is still an open question. What we do know is this: within the span of just a few decades, nearly every industrialized nation on Earth adopted the same fundamental system for recording human existence. A system built on documentation. On registration. On the idea that every life begins with an Entry in a government archive. Why it spread so quickly? Who ultimately shaped the architecture behind it? And how that system will evolve in the age of digital identity? Those questions are still unfolding today, and the answers may reveal far more about the modern world than most of us ever expected.